This is Duke University.
I just want to introduce our next speaker. Maytha Alhassen is a University of Southern California Provost Ph.D. Fellow in American Studies and Ethnicity. It's a real privilege to have her here. She's a performing artist herself, an activist, a budding scholar, and her paper today will be The Ummah Imperative, appraising the influence of Islamic humanism on Malcolm's pro-Palestine politics. Thank you.
Okay. First, I want to start by thanking all the organizers, everybody from staff, from Carrie, who's just crawling under this podium. Everybody, I don't have enough time to name everybody, and my panelists. I'm very, very honored to be here. I'm honored to hear you all speak as well. And thank you, Omid, for playing that clip. It's a beautiful segue for us to think about how Malcolm is sometimes remembered in the Haley way, in the way of sharp, static transformations that are rigid. And I would like to argue more so for what something scholar in the audience, Zahir Ali, I'm going to plug his presentation. He's going to be on a panel after this one, calls a shattering instead of a break from the nation. So also, as I explained, this presentation is based off on a paper that I constructed for academic publication that I'm still trying to figure out where I want to plug in. So it's much longer, so I've fought with myself to try to condense it. So I'm not going to be covering as much of the Ummah imperative and constructing it as an argument using Quranic verses and some hadith reports as I would like to. I'm just going to do a brief overview. But this is what I really want to start with. I want to start with the idea of Black liberation's relationship to Palestine. How many of you heard of the Dream Defenders delegation to Palestine in January? Raise of hands, hands high. Yes, thank you so much. For all those who have not heard about it, it took place from January 2nd to the 12th. It was a delegation of Black social justice activists, artists, and academics from Dream Defenders, a co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project 100, and activists from Ferguson from Hands Up United. I was one of the co-organizers, along with one of the founders of Dream Defenders, Palestinian brother by the name of Ahmed Abu Zunaid, who's also a Muslim, of the delegation. And our aim really was inspired by the legacy that Malcolm left with us. And it was a legacy of internationalism. It was a legacy of global Islam. It was also a legacy of another term I'd love to invoke today, Cedric Robinson's idea of the Black radical tradition. And this is what I would like to argue is how we can understand Malcolm today. I don't want to be one of those people that reinvents him in the way I want to see him. I just want to take the data that is present and think about what Malcolm is teaching us now. Not if he was alive, what would he say? What was his history teaching us now? So I just pulled up a little statement that we included in our proposal and our letter to our delegates to tell them and explain to them why this trip was so important. As Malcolm X toured the Middle East and Africa, embarking on the Hajj and attending Organization of African Unity and Arab League meetings in 1964, the outspoken Black liberation leader began to assess the African-American struggle through the lens of human rights at the international level. And then we went on to quote passages from an op-ed Malcolm X wrote in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic, where he's pretty much advocating for what we call today the modern BDS movement. Who's unfamiliar with BDS? BDS is boycott, divestment, sanctions. It was a movement started by Palestinians in Palestine and is almost uniformly consensually accepted by Palestinians. And interesting enough, the day that our delegation landed in Ben Gurion Airport, me and Ahmed couldn't go because we're Arabs, and it would have been a huge liability. He actually physically can't go. And I was instructed, because I have a Lebanese-Syrian background, to take the border. The day we landed there, another delegation that some authors have accused of faith washing, the Muslim Leadership Initiative, landed in Ben Gurion Airport. So I just want us to think about the different trajectories that Hisham and Suhail had set up for us to understand where Islam has gone since Malcolm, American Islam. So, as I said, this framework, Black radical tradition, global Islam, Islamic humanism. I'm going to break down what I mean by Islamic humanism. Internationalism, I kind of, because I'm a big fan of the Abdul Halim Hafez song, Sawah, I kind of really like the idea of Malcolm being a transient traveler who, you know, we long for. So a lot of my data comes from Malcolm X's own diaries that Hisham was talking about. What's interesting though, and I know there is a reproduction of it edited by Herb Boyd and Ilyasa Shabazz, but there's a lot that's not included, especially a lot of his outlines and sketches for his speeches, his thought process. This one on the right in particular, do you see where it says birdhouse? It's a little hard to read. Bird, horse equals cripple, hypocrisy. Can you see that? That's actually going to come up in his op-ed. So he's thinking these things through, as we would too. And you know, there's his looking at his core beliefs. Okay, this is what I mean about Islamic humanism. The theoretical framework, what I mean by an ummic imperative, it's in terms of a traditional Sunni Islam orientation, engaged practice of tawheed, of unity, through embodying a spirit of brohood. Why do I say brohood? In Malcolm X's diaries, this is what I found so fascinating, is how he abbreviates things. So because he's writing brotherhood so much, because he's so impressed with the spirit of brotherhood, as he calls it, and the level of hospitality he was receiving on his travels, he would shorten it to brohood. Human rights as defined, actually, NOI, Nation of Islam, that's another interesting thing. After he went to Hajj, he continued to use the Nation of Islam's own political agenda, and that is freedom, justice, and equality. Again, he would abbreviate FJE. And you actually, if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know the significance of that, because he never actually writes the full words out. He only writes FJE. Practice. So for him, the way that he implements this to create the praxical Islamic humanism is Islam as an antidote to America's cancer of racism. And he says this frequently, as he's talking to Arabs, as he's talking to Africans, and then speaking to his own audience back home, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, Organization of African American Unity, and it shows up in his speeches. And then lastly, human rights for 22 million African Americans. So as Omid was setting up, Professor Saifi, some people would like to imagine Malcolm as this post-racial, race-transcendent Muslim after he goes to Hajj. This is not the case. His quote-unquote racial consciousness does not diminish. And what happens is that he starts to have critical engagement with Muslim press, and as Hisham brought up, when he was in conversation with the Islamic Center of Geneva, Said Ramadan's institution, and he was questioned in their newsletter of why he brings up the issue of race, he provides a very strong case for his first commitment, being the 22 million African Americans. And of course, another commitment of his, third world, dark-skinned, and anti-imperialist liberation movements worldwide, as Suhail did a brilliant job conceptualizing for us. Spirit of brohood. Okay, so this is some of Malcolm's words from his diaries. Is this from his diary? These are from some of his words, but I actually, we'll go to this later. This is a brief sketch into the world of the global Islam that Malcolm X was encountering after he left the nation. This is Mahmoud Shawarbi. He was the president of the Federation of Islamic Associations, which had an office on Riverside in Manhattan. And he was kind of his, I don't want to say parental replacement for Elijah Muhammad, but Shawarbi figured very significantly in Malcolm's life. He's the one that set him up to this global Islamic network within the Arab world. And this guy in particular is really important to Malcolm's understanding of Sunni traditional Islam's take on social justice. This is Abdul Rahman Hassan Azam. He was the founder of the Arab League, the first Secretary General, but really very interesting enough, he was an anti-imperialist figure. He went to Libya, he's Egyptian, he went to Libya to fight in the resistance movement, and he was studying in London to become a doctor, but he left to go and fight in the Balkans, and this was pre-World War I period, and he was banned from returning to England. And in that process, he goes back and establishes a base in Cairo, and so he becomes involved in this idea of this awakening of an Arab nationalism. And what's interesting about Abdul Rahman Hassan Azam is that he was known to the American world as well. So AIPAC, let me get the exact language. Hold on. What did AIPAC call him? The American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee created an anti-Semitism report, and they included him. And ADL, Anti-Defamation League, called him a troublemaker to look out for. And let me see if I can pull this up for a second. So what was Malcolm inspired by? Azam Pasha, he was known as Azam Pasha, wrote this book, Eternal Message of Muhammad, published in Arabic in 1938. And when he was in Jeddah, and he met Azam Pasha, because Azam Pasha was exiled from Egypt, and he was part of this sort of network of, I guess, Muslim Brotherhood Ikhwan figures who were exiled from Egypt during that time period. We could go, that's a whole nother discussion, which is very, very fascinating in terms of who Malcolm links up to. So when Malcolm was staying with Azam Pasha in Jeddah before he goes to Hajj, he was given this book. And in his diaries, I'm going to pull this up. This is what he says about Azam Pasha. Azam Pasha's vast depth of wisdom, his frank expression of his convictions, and his way of giving fatherly advice never ceases to impress me. It was he who gave me his own room and bed here at the Jeddah Palace as soon as he learned that I had not made advance hotel reservations and that the crowded pilgrimage season made none available. Never have I met a more educated intellectual than Azam Pasha. His vast reservoir of knowledge and its variety seem unlimited. Racial lineage and descendants of the Prophet, differences in the Muslim world, only to the extent it has been influenced by the West. He gave me his room at the Jeddah Palace while he stayed with his son. Such hospitality, never so honored. Okay. So let's move on to the next segment. We got the praxical Islamic humanism down. I'm going to be talking about how that was an impetus for how he saw Palestine and how that informed his anti-Zionist politics. So I'm starting with his trip that he took to Gaza. Malcolm's 2-day trip to Gaza, this is a schedule of it, started early on a Saturday morning on the 5th of September from the Arab Summit Conference opening up in Alexandria, Egypt. At this time, Gaza, pre-67 war, was still under the control of Egypt. Malcolm was thus able to freely travel in and out of the territory and its refugee camps. After visiting the Aswan, he and an unnamed Egyptian friend entered no man's land and an Arab, as in quotations he wrote, Arab refugee camps and a hospital. At lunch that day, he dined with Colonel Mustafa Hafaka, the assistant to the governor of the Aswan province, and Arab Palestine's religious leaders. He, along with his entourage, left Gaza the next day at noon. Other than noting that the spirit of Allah was strong that evening, little is written about his time in Gaza or immediate revelations. However, one man's story of harrowing escapes from Israel bleeds through the pages of Malcolm's diary and becomes part of the lifeblood Malcolm later uses to pump out vigorously argued opposition papers on his anti-Zionist politics. Based on Malcolm's diary entries, one person's story in relation to the Palestine issue stands out, that of Gazan poet Harun Hashem Rashid. That September 5th evening, he listened to Rashid's account of his escape from Israel in 1956, a time historically remembered as the Khan Yunis massacre. An event that unfolded on November 3rd, 1956, and marks a dark day in Palestinian history when 275 civilians were murdered by the Israeli military. After the narrative encounter, Malcolm begins to make more mentions and references to Palestine in his political comparisons to African American plight and the plight of dark-skinned world. Touching on the impact of his story, previous to his encounter, like many Black nationalists before Malcolm had actually praised Israel as a paradigmatic model for a Black nation, for what Black nationalism's end would look like. And that was actually one of the first mentions was in a speech from 1960 in Boston. And a scholar by the name of Garrett Felber is the one who's written about this, if you want to look it up. The famed, I don't know if he's published, but get in touch with him. Oh, am I at 5 minutes? Oh, shoot. Okay. So the famed Palestinian activist whose words influence framing and understanding of the Israel-Palestine situation goes both unmentioned in Haley and the Autobiography and in the Reinvention. And so I go on to explain Rashid's importance in Palestinian poetry's history. But let's look at the entry itself. This is the entry that Malcolm put in his diary entries to the side, and this is from Rashid narrating his escape. This is the day it happened. And he also explained the significance of being told to have their hands up while they were forced to flee. I'm gonna read it for those who can't see. We must return, no boundaries should exist, no obstacles can stop us. Cry out refugees, we shall return. Tell the mountains, we shall return. Tell the alley, we shall return. We are going back to our youth. Palestine calls us to arm ourselves, and we are armed, and we are going to fight, and we must return. So the other interesting thing I want you to take into account is something that Hisham brought up, that's the idea of art and struggle. I would argue that poetry and witness were fundamental contributions to the way that Malcolm saw the complexion of his politics. This is another series of notes that he has in his diaries: Spain, Moroccans, America, Indians, Negroes, Africa, Arabs, indigenous to Palestine, Israelis from Europe, colonialism, imperialism, Zionism equals racism. That's his conclusion. So basically, this is the original inhabitants of this land. And remember, he used to say so-called Negroes. That's what he's referring to. He then meets with PLO chairman at the time, Ahmed Shukari, on September 15th at Shepherd's Hotel. I don't know if anything happened. He just mentioned meeting him. So there's a lot you could speculate about this. But this is the most important part. September 17th, 1964, an article gets published. It's called the Zionist Logic, and this is where Malcolm goes to town with, I see a lot of phones going up. I love that. I can send it to you, but take pictures. That's great. This is where Malcolm really goes to town with the project of Zionism. And again, he sees Zionism not so different from colonialism, from imperialism, and from racism. For him, this is the equal sign that he referred to in his notes. And he also calls it 20th century dollarism. So there he's hinting towards neocolonialism as being the project of Zionism. Again, remember I mentioned the bird equals crippled. This is what he wrote in the op-ed, and I know sometimes you see people pass around this through social media as a quote of his, but it's decontextualized. Where did it come from? It came from this op-ed. They cripple the bird's wing, and then they condemn it for not flying as fast as they. And then also in the essay, he brings up that same thing of the Moroccans this is Moorish Spain. This is Native American America. He does the same sort of outline, and then he says, this is Arab Palestine. This is not Israel. Let's see. This is another quote from the op-ed. If Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule all other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched than that of the former European colonial powers, more entrenched. Let's think about that, I guess, as we get to the Q&A. This new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive and objective. So, can I add my conclusion? Are we done? Okay, we'll leave it at that. My conclusion is basically, yes, we have to look at the Islamic humanism, the Black radical tradition, his internationalism, and the role of witness and poetry if we want to understand the direction of Malcolm's politics. Thank you so much.